Hey everyone, this is Brown at I Have Brown, and today we are going to be talking about Mortem. So Mortem was a horror anthology that came out in 1992, and it was a part of the Abyss horror line, which I have covered a few entries from in a couple of past reviews. But Abyss was a horror line that Dell Publishing had put out in the early 90s, and they definitely had their shares of successes, namely Kathy Koja's The Cipher, Brian Hodges' Nightlife, Melanie Thames' Prodigal, Rick R. Reed's Obsessed, and one of my personal favorites, Dale Hoover's Shadow Twin. But this was their first anthology entry. And so I happened to find this at a half-price books near me, probably about, I'd say, 2, maybe 3 years ago now. And I recently got around to reading it. And this was actually pretty good. And I think that even if I hadn't read any of the other Abyss entries or novels, I think that I would have still appreciated this. But having read the Abyss horror novels that I have, and then reading this horror anthology, it kind of made me look at things from a slightly different perspective than I would have, say, if I had just read this one by itself, without having read any of the other books in the horror line. Because, you know, the whole idea of Abyss was that they were going to try and, you know, get into, say, the, you know, psychological roots of horror, I guess you could say, you know, the mental trauma that can come into play when it comes to either crafting horror or experiencing horror. And so with that in mind, I really feel that some of the stories in here definitely went along with that mission statement, but some of the other stories, while definitely not bad stories, were basically tales that you would find somewhere along the lines of Rod Serling's Night Gallery. And so you have a mixture of, you know, good stories and then all around great stories. There really wasn't any bad story in here that I could think of. It's just that, you know, trying to, you know, look at things from the perspective of going along with with Abyss's mission statement, it kind of made me look at things from a slightly different perspective. But all around, though, this was still a very well done horror anthology, and you know, it came out in 1992, and some of the stories in here were actually published as early as, say, 1989, but they're all, you know, collected here. And so I really think that the stories that were the best were the ones that, say, you know, hit you from the perspective of, say, dealing with, you know, the trauma of losing a loved one or something like that, or maybe even going as far as to say, looking at horror from an international perspective. And so I'm not going to review every single story in here because there are 17 stories, and that would be a rather long review, I think. But I'll just, you know, touch base on some of the ones that, you know, made an impression to me. And that's not to slight anyone's work here. It's just that, you know, anytime you got an anthology, you have stuff that, you know, is just sort of filler, and other times you still have stuff that make an impression. And so I think the ones that, you know, really made the most impression on me was, I mean, there were the stories that, you know, dealt with mainly loss. Like, say, for instance, let's see, well, the first story in here is called Each Night, Each Year by Kathryn Ptacek, and I hope I'm saying her name right. But, for example, I mean, in her story, I mean, she's, her protagonist is having to contend with, you know, the ghost of her father who passed away from cancer. And if you know someone, or you yourself have experienced, say, you know, losing a loved one to cancer, then this story really hits home, because it describes, like, the physical effects of, you know, cancer on the human body, as well as the emotional toll it takes not only on the person going through it, but on, say, the family member who's trying to, care for the person. And so the protagonist in this story is constantly flashing back to that. But the thing is, it's getting to a point where she's being haunted by the ghost of her father, and not in, a good way. And I'm not saying hauntings are good or anything, but it's just that, she's literally seeing her father in the cancer-ridden state that she remembered him in, and basically, it's at the point where, he's crawling along the floorboards because, in his last few days, I mean, he got to where there were times where he couldn't even walk, simply because of, how the cancer had affected him. Like, he was having to crawl to the bathroom, that kind of thing. And, he's got this, sad, almost betrayed look in his eyes because, there are times where she just wished that he would die simply because of, she knows that it wasn't, that his life was no longer a joy to experience for him, simply because every single day he was dealing with, what the cancer was doing to him. And she was becoming overwhelmed because, I mean, she wasn't a medical professional or anything like that. And she was having to put aside her life, to deal with, her father and his terminal illness. And it just really took a toll on her. And so it's like when she's seeing the ghost, it's like every single, time she sees him, which is becoming more and more and more frequent, it's just really shaking her up and taking a toll on her. And in this story, I think, I mean, considering this is like the first story in the anthology, and especially coming off of the heels of a rather fanciful, even comical introduction, this story, it's like, okay, this is definitely something that belongs in the realm of abyss horror, because I mean, it really taps into the all too human and familiar feelings of loss and regret, and just I guess you could say even borderline insanity, because she's not flat out insane, but it's definitely getting her to a point where she's becoming more and more unhinged. And so I felt like in some ways this story kind of drew some inspiration from Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, in the sense that the theme of guilt comes up, in the sense that she feels guilty for wanting her father to die out of just pure frustration at times. And so but instead of just hearing a heartbeat, she's hearing like the gasping and wheezing sounds, and the sounds of his hands pulling his body along the floorboards. And so it's definitely some inspiration from Edgar Allan Poe in that regard. But so that considering that was the first story, it definitely hooked me. And so and one of my other favorite stories was Timeskip by Charles de Lint, and it was a change of pace in the sense that I'm not going to say it was lighthearted, but it wasn't as, say, morbid as Each Night, Every Night was. And Timeskip was definitely something that I feel like would have belonged right at home in, say, Rod Serling's Night Gallery TV series. Because I mean, you have the idea of this guy and a friend of his. Actually, she becomes his girlfriend, but the two of them have been seeing this ghost. Oftentimes it's whenever it rains, and actually that seems to be the only time. Whenever it rains, a certain spot in the neighborhood, they see this ghost of someone from like a long time ago, and he's looking terrified, like he's looking for someone, or he doesn't know where he is, but then he'll just vanish. And so this guy and his girlfriend, they decide, well, hey, what if one of us tries to talk to the guy? And and so they decide to go through with it, and the girl, the girlfriend, she's the one who makes contact with the ghost. Like, she gets in the ghost's way and sort of just reaches out to him to say, hey, it's okay, and what have you. But the guy, unfortunately, he's kind of helpless to watch, to do anything but watch, as the ghost sort of registers that there's a person reaching out to him and making contact with him. And so the ghost actually takes her back into whatever time he came from. And so the guy, the boyfriend, he goes after her, and for a brief period of time he finds himself in an unfamiliar landscape, which is the same area, the same city, but from a long time ago. And he nearly becomes lost there, but he's able to make his way back with the assistance of a friend of his, because he had actually made friends with this one girl who was kind of a starving artist, and she was enthusiastic about stuff about the paranormal as well. And so she had tried to warn him about getting stuck in the time period of wherever ghosts, wherever the ghosts came from. But she said that if he ever found himself in this situation where he's going back into the time period where the ghost came from, to basically just listen for her voice, because she was watching this while all this was going on. And so thankfully he's able to latch onto her call to him, and he remembers where he came from, and so he's barely able to make it back to his own time. But unfortunately, though, he couldn't save his girlfriend. And so now the scene has changed. It's like every time it rains at that spot, instead of seeing the initial ghost that they saw, he now sees the ghost of his girlfriend. And she is dressed in the attire from the time period that the ghost came from, and she has this sort of forlorn look on his face, on her face, but it's kind of resigned. And so the guy is kind of made peace with the fact that he may not be able to go back and save her, but he's determined to find a way to let her know that, hey, I haven't forgotten you, even if he can't go back to the time that she came from, or the time that she's trapped in. So Timeskip, you could argue that there's a little bit of science fiction involved, in a sense that time travel does come into play, but this was definitely something that was more, it wasn't as hard-hitting as, say, that first story was, but it was more, I guess, fanciful, and almost entertaining in some ways, in the sense that you get to like the characters, and you're getting drawn into their plan to make contact with someone from a different time period, but they don't really take the consequences seriously until it's too late, that kind of thing. But this was a good story too. But another story that made an impression was Resettling, by Steve Rasnic Tim and the late Melanie Tim. And Melanie Tim, she wrote a few novels in the Abyss horror line, one of which, one of the ones I mentioned earlier, Prodigal, it was definitely one of the best entries in that series. And so I think it's really cool that she took part in a short story here for this anthology. But basically you have this family, a husband and wife and their daughter, who move into this house, and unfortunately this house seems to kind of have a twisted life of its own, and it starts to exert a negative influence on the family, and it's to a point where everyone's involved is starting to be driven insane. And the daughter, she is in an attempt to get away from, the insanity and horror of seeing her, mother and father become darker versions of themselves. She becomes more drawn into the house, and that just may be what the house wants. And so I thought this was a nice, sort of subversion of the haunted house story, because it is a haunted house story for sure, and you have all sorts of familiar tropes coming into play, such as, the house exerting a negative influence on the people living in it. But at the same time, though, this is definitely an instance where, you see how there's almost like a plan that like an intelligent plan that the house has, to draw someone into it, so it won't be alone anymore, because apparently the house was alone for some time. And so, the whole family, is just sort of it's almost like a twisted experiment almost, because, it's like the house is wanting to, draw someone in, but it's drawn to the innocence of the daughter. And so, the daughter will never get tired of it. The daughter, will never, I guess you could say, grow up and, become disillusioned with life, if it brings her into it. And so the mother and father, they're just left with, the tragedy of, their daughter, eventually disappearing, and, hearing her from time to time, but, they're left with the misery of each other, because at this point, all the negative influence that the house had, it brought out all this, repressed baggage that they'd been keeping in check, because they'd been focusing on, being a, close, loving family. But it was like they were able to sort of, talk about, their problems, or just pretend their problems didn't exist, but because the house exerts such an influence on them, it all came out. And so even when they're aware that they're being manipulated, they can't help the fact that, they're telling each other things that they'd rather not, the other person hear, and they just, they're just left with, seeing each other for a first time in all their, I guess you could say, twisted versions of themselves. Because they're still human and everything, but now they know all this, dirty laundry. Now they're exposed to all this, sort of, dirty laundry that they have, and that they were just sort of not talking about and keeping from each other. And so they're left with that, as well as the fact that their daughters disappeared, and the house has taken their daughter from them and isn't going to give her back, and they're helpless to try to get her back. And even if they did try to do so, they're left with the impression that, their daughter wouldn't want to come back. And so this was actually a pretty effective horror story, in a sense that it kind of taps in, much like the very first story here that was in this volume. It does a good job of really getting into the darkness of the human mind, and how, say, something supernatural can play on it. And Melanie Tim, is one of the two writers. It's no surprise that she's involved in a story like this. And so, her and Steve Rasnic, Tim, her husband, I believe, they did a really good job on collaborating for this story. Another story that made an impression on me was called, let's see, give me a sec here. Nine Gables by James Howard Kunstler. And this is kind of a, another night gallery type of story, in the sense that it's kind of a breather, especially compared to the intensity of some of the other stories. But it was kind of comical in a way, because you have this husband and wife who are kind of up there in years, or probably in their 40s and maybe early 50s, but they've been married for a while, and they've been living in the city, and their marriage is kind of on the rocks. But they're thinking, well, hey, what if we move out to the country? What if we do like we were talking about all these years ago? What if we have a bed and breakfast out there? And so they're like, okay, let's do this. I mean, we're at the age where we can do this. So we have enough money for this. Let's go. And so they do. They go out to the country. They have this bed and breakfast, which is a really nice model and everything. But they but they start getting some unusual clientele, and it turns out these clientele are ghosts of people who died a long time ago. And the funny thing is, the husband, he starts having an affair with one of the female ghosts, and trying to make it look like nothing's going on, but the wife's starting to figure out that something's going on, because this ghost, she's never paid for her room. I mean, other people have come in and paid, but she's not doing so because, well, she's a ghost. And so then something similar starts happening with the wife. Like, she starts seeing a male ghost, and having an affair with him, and he's not paying either. And so eventually, the husband and wife, they sort of, realize that, hey, this is what's going on here. But they decide, you know what? We're actually kind of happier this way, because it's like with each other, they don't really enjoy any sort of physical intimacy anymore. But at the same time, these, ethereal, lovers that they've come into contact with have sort of, brought more spark into their life, to the point where, say, when they're doing their duties in the hotel and everything, in the bed and breakfast hotel, I mean, they're enthusiastic about their lives. They're even friendly with each other. They just sleep in separate rooms, but with their ghostly lovers. And so I thought this was kind of a more lighthearted story, in a sense that you have this bit of on one hand, the husband's trying to keep the wife from figuring out what's going on, and then it gets to where the wife's trying to keep the husband from figuring out what's going on, but then eventually they're like, oh, okay, so we're both kind of on the same page here. So I thought that was, kind of a nice touch, and it was nice that I thought it was kind of a nice change of pace from the ghosts not being, so grim and morbid, that kind of thing. So that was definitely another story. But let's see. Eyes of the Swordmaker. This was another story that I thought was really well done. It was by Gordon Linzner, and this takes place in feudal Japan, I believe. It was in the time of the samurai, and it's about this guy who he's a sword maker, and he's very skilled at his craft, but he can't match the master craftsmanship of this other sword maker in the village. And basically everyone he's talked to has said that the man refuses to teach his secrets to whoever asks. And so everyone's going to this guy, and the protagonist of the story is being forced to contend with the fact that his customers are dwindling because they're going to this master swordsmaker. But the funny thing is, this master swordmaker, he is skilled at his craft, obviously, but he's not happy about it. In fact, he kind of curses it at times. And so this guy, he decides, okay, in kind of in desperation, because several people have commissioned his skills to improve their swords. He's not going to be able to make it, because everyone's going to this master sword maker. And so what he does is he sneaks into the guy's place late at night in disguise and slashes his eyes. He doesn't want to kill the guy, but he just wants to take away his ability to craft swords. And unfortunately, so while he went in with the intention of permanently injuring the guy, he didn't actually want to kill the guy. But unfortunately, the guy is injury gets infected and he ends up dying from it. But then his ghost starts appearing to this, Swordmaker, who now everyone's going to because he's the only person in the village qualified to craft swords. And so he starts, seeing the ghost of the man he inadvertently killed, and he also gets the man's skills. But the problem is, now he's being met with, the ghost of not only, the Swordmaker he, inadvertently killed, but it turns out the same thing happened to another Swordmaker who was in the village before, and so on and so forth. And so all these ghosts are haunting the guy, and, to a point where, he can craft a sword on a master skill level now, but he hardly has a moment's peace because he's constantly dealing with all this stuff. And so I thought that this was a treat of a story because, anytime you deal with something that is a ghost story from a foreign land, you have a sort of mysticism involved that you don't really get with, say, a story that you have, say, from your own homeland, if that makes sense. But that was definitely one of my favorite stories in here, simply because of the international style of it. But let's see, give me a sec here. Oh yeah, the last three stories that I think were very well done, or let me rephrase that. The last three stories that I think were honestly great were, let's see, The Brush of Soft Wings by Melissa Mia Hale, or Hall, actually, sorry about that. And she, she writes a story that's kind of like a dark, a dark deconstruction of the Twilight Zone episode with, I think it was called Mr. Death with Robert Redford. And, whereas that story looked upon, say, the personification of death as, say, someone who is ultimately not a fearsome individual, but rather a gentle being who simply has a job to do, and wants those whose souls he's coming for to not be afraid, and just to see that they finally have their time to rest, or go to their next destiny. This story, it starts off like that, in the sense that there's this woman who she's elderly, and she makes friends with this little girl, and it turns out this girl is actually death itself. But just when you're thinking it's going to end on a heartwarming, soft, friendly note, which, the story seems to be, playing with that, because, the woman goes from grouchy and irritable to, compassionate and loving with this girl. And then she finds out that this girl's death, and the girl has come for her, but she just wanted to kind of, show her that death isn't something to be feared. But nonetheless, though, the final, couple of pages, has, the girl hugging, the woman, and it describes the process of her body basically breaking down and her soul leaving her physical body. And it's not loving and compassionate. And, the woman is, left, screaming as she dies. And so I thought that this was a nice little, twist on, that kind of story, in the sense that you were thinking it's going to be, death is, just a caring individual who wants, people to, rest peacefully, but this is more along the lines of, well, maybe death wants that, but since death is a little kid, apparently, doesn't have much in the way of comprehension of, the psychological and physical impact of, the person, having their soul leave their body, and it's not pleasant. And so I thought that was a nice little twist on the story there, or, to that type of story. But let's see, the last two stories were Brothers by David B. Silva and Haunted World by Robert R. McCammon. And so Brothers, I think, is one of those stories that, I mean, if you have a sibling, then it's something that hits a lot harder, because, it's just one of those stories where, this guy, he this or I should say this young man, he and his brother, they've been there for each other through thick and thin, but their mom has basically been kind of depressed, and she talks to one of the brothers, but pretends that it seems like she doesn't acknowledge the other. And so and also anytime anyone interacts with this one particular brother, there's almost an unnerving quality to their reactions to this person. And so eventually you find out that the protagonist, his brother has more or less been dead this whole time. And in fact his brother actually died a long time ago in childbirth. And so basically, this brother, he's more or less had an imaginary friend for who Lord knows how long, thinking that, hey, he's got a brother that, no one, wants to pay attention to for some reason this whole time. But, basically, the ghost of, the brother who could have been, was, just trying to look out for him and trying to help him get to a point where he could stand on his own 2 feet. And, unfortunately, his brother, kind of reinforces, this message by, committing suicide in front of him, namely by hanging himself. But, after he does so, he vanishes. And that's when, the brother who survived, childbirth, that's the one, who's left behind. And, he realizes that, his brother can't be there for him anymore. And, it's just, he has to grow up. And this was kind of a, I realize I just kind of spoiled it, but this was kind of a, heartbreaking story in a way, because, it's like, you got this person, who's been in your life as long as you can remember, and then you find out that they weren't even really there in the first place, or they were there, but only to your eye. And as far as everyone else is concerned, this person's been dead the whole time, and this person's been trying to help you, but the sad thing is they don't want to leave either, but they have to. And so that was definitely, I think, one of those stories that I'm not going to say it was out and out horror, but in terms of what you would feel on an emotional level, I think it did a very good job of fitting into, say, the mission statement that Abyss had at the time. In the sense of, getting to, say, something psychological and, something that kind of shakes you to your soul, if that makes sense. But the very last story in here is called Haunted World, as I mentioned, and it's by Robert R. McCammon. And it takes the idea of, if you've seen the movie Dawn of the Dead by George Romero, there's this line of dialogue where I believe it was, when there's no more room in hell, the dead will walk the earth. Well, imagine that, but imagine the ghost of every single person who's died suddenly coming back to, into our world. And at first, it's something that's rather fascinating, because you see all these ghosts of people from different lifetimes wandering the earth, lost and confused. And so you could see someone from, say, the 1700s, walking by a Viking raiding party or something like that. But then it starts to get to where these ghosts, these bitter, confused, lost souls, they start to manifest on a physical level, in the sense that if they try to touch you, or if they try to, say, hit you with a weapon that they have, that weapon is going to leave a mark. That touch is going to be felt. And all of the living people in the world at this point, and this is happening all over the world, and the story is being told by this one father who's trying to contend with all this and with his family in this small rural town. But there's news reports that this is happening all over the world. So it's not just a small town, but you're seeing it in the small town though. And he and everyone else, they get to the point of where they're thinking, well, hey, if we just go somewhere else, the ghosts won't be able to get us. Well, that's kind of a bit of deluding themselves, because at this point the ghosts are everywhere, and apparently their physical interactions with their world are getting more frequent. And so the story does not end on, say, an uplifting note, just an uncertain one. Knowing that, but you get the feeling that things aren't going to go well for those who are left on this world. But as far as ending things on a somber note, Haunted World did a very good job. And so while there are other stories in this collection, these are the ones that made most of an impression on me. And so I would say, if you want to, if you like horror anthologies with kind of a variation of tone and theme, Mortem is definitely a good work. It's a good work of literature in the realm of horror anthologies. And as far as, say, the first horror anthology that Abyss put out, they did a pretty good job with this one. And I'm going to go ahead and give this one 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good collection, and as I mentioned, there's not a bad story in here. It's just that when you have the type of stories that really elicit sort of a emotional response from you, or that kind of shakes you to your core to the point where you kind of have to put the book down for a sec, simply because maybe you're at a point in your life where you can relate to some of the emotion that's on hand in the story, that's pretty good. But on the other hand, though, when you have the more tame stories, I mean, they're not bad stories, they're good stories in their own right, but they're more along the lines of stories that you would find in other horror anthologies that are commonplace, if that makes sense. Whereas Abyss, though, because of that mission statement they have, at least in my case, I guess maybe I was expecting something along the lines of that level of horror in every type of story, if that makes sense. Or let me phrase that level of an emotional response with every type of story. But the reality is, I mean, just because a horror anthology is coming from a certain book line, that doesn't necessarily guarantee every single book in this anthology is going to be of the same quality, if that makes sense. And that is something that I knew going in. But having read some of the horror novels from the Abyss line, plus having read the short stories in here that had that much of an emotional impact, it's just kind of it's a reminder that it's basically your regular horror anthology, when you get right down to it, if that makes sense. Not to say it's a bad anthology, it is a good anthology. But yeah, so like I said, 4 out of 5 stars. This was good. And so if you like horror anthologies, I would say definitely pick this one up if you can find it, or order it. And so like if you see it at a bookstore, definitely check it out. And you don't have to have read any of the other horror novels in the Abyss line in order to appreciate this, but I think it would be kind of a bonus if you read a couple of them. Like, say for instance, you read The Cipher or Prodigal. I think you'd probably have an idea of the type of stories that Abyss was going for with this collection. So anyway, though, thanks for taking the time to check this out. You got any questions, comments, please drop a line, let me know. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. But y'all have a good day. Take care. Bye.